Okay, grade 10, it's nice to see you again. We are moving along, but with things that are changing, the government is saying that we all have to stay home, including me, that they're closing down the university and they don't want professors like myself to be, going through classrooms or getting the IT department to help them out or to be working in the library or anything like that. They want us to sort of have a bit of a lockdown, and for that reason we have no choice but to change our strategy. So I think starting next week we're not going to have this exact formula. I'm just going to be talking from my laptop, and I don't see that as a big problem. I don't know if the quality of the film will be different. I suspect it will be because usually your laptop is not as good as a film camera. So this time we're going to be using the laptop, and we're going to be continuing using Google Classroom. I don't want you sending your homework to me by email or by any Google documents. I want you to send it through Google Classroom. It helps me to be super efficient, and it makes me look better so that I can work more efficiently. And so that means that I'm helping you, but I want you to help me by only sending your material to me through Google Classroom. And if you, for some reason, are not able to use Google Classroom, or it has not sent you an invitation, or you cannot accept the invitation, then send me a new email address and we will get that going again. Secondly, I just want to go over a few of the common problems with the homework. I was pleased because everybody did their homework, which is kind of like the first time it's ever happened. I kind of felt it was too brief, your answers. Some of you gave me like 2 sentences as an answer. I couldn't believe how brief it is. It's not quite good enough. And you didn't really explain the role played by trading blocks to promote international trade. That was one of the questions, and you kind of just talked about what it's all about, but you didn't really tell me how trading blocks actually help to increase the amount of trade that every country does, such as Vietnam. So those are 2 issues that I wasn't totally satisfied with. But on the whole, just the fact that everybody did their homework, I was kind of amazed, really. I was surprised and I was pleased. So let's go on from there. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. We've got 2 questions sent in by you guys. And I'm going to try to answer the question: why do countries need a trading bloc when a bilateral trade agreement between 2 countries would be okay? That's a good question. Really what that is it's like a debate between bilateral and multilateral trade. I think it's always been the case that countries have had like special agreements. For example, Laos and Cambodia, I'm not 100% certain of this, but historically obviously have been attached to Vietnam for the last million years. So it would seem normal that even 100 or 200 years ago that Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam had some sort of trading agreement, or maybe it wasn't even necessary. People just basically came over and tried to sell items to other people on the same peninsula. So I think historically it is a question that can be looked upon in terms of how do countries begin trading. Usually there were no borders. 500 years ago nobody had any borders. In fact, only 200 years ago did most of the borders come about. And for that reason, people would just sort of sell their items when they wanted to. More recently, there have been, for example, agreements before the ASEAN countries came together and made a trade bloc. You had Singapore and Malaysia used to have a an agreement where they would trade together, and you had South Korea and Taiwan. They were having, they would have sort of bilateral trade agreements, and that they would actually make some decision that would suggest that people could trade without actually having any taxes or any infringement on their trade. The main advantage, of course, when you have many, many countries is the ease at which companies can begin trading, that they can start specializing in what they do really, really well and allow other countries to produce what they do better and then import those products. It's a sort of a comparative advantage type of argument, and I think that, there are arguments on both sides, but I think that historically, there probably was no need of any agreement, and more recently, many countries, after seeing the benefits of the EU and NAFTA, have decided to follow in their steps, and that they have decided that they want to come together with as many countries as possible to expand their trade and to gain many of the benefits, such as economic growth, due to that form of economic cooperation. Question number 2, if countries became less independent, or if countries become less independent and have their culture threatened, why do they agree to a trade bloc? Well, that's a good question. I mean, obviously they feel that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, and that they have just come to the conclusion that, yes, culture is important, but in today's modern world, they may have made a decision that particularly the younger population don't really care too much about their own culture, which is a sad state of affairs. And for that reason, they've decided that the benefits of economic growth override any threat to issues of freedom or independence or threatened cultures, etc., etc. So it's like a cost-benefit analysis where you have to decide, do the benefits of free trade outweigh the dangers involved with culture and with other issues? And obviously a lot of countries, including Vietnam and Canada, have both said yes, and that they want to benefit from a lot of these issues related to international trade. I mean, North Korea would probably be one of those countries that feel very threatened by other cultures and other ways of life, and they're quite happy to promote self-sufficiency, and they don't really need to have too much cooperation with their neighbors. I mean, they do have a lot of cooperation with China and to a lesser extent with Russia, but on the whole, North Korea is fairly isolated, and they obviously feel quite okay about that, and that they are prepared to continue their strategies, their economic strategies, based on the fact that they don't need to trade so much. I don't know if you could call them an autarky, where an autarky is a country that really doesn't trade at all. But they do trade, and sometimes they trade in a tricky-dicky kind of way, where people don't realize that they're trading, that they're trading without permission or whatever. But they survive, and for that reason, they feel that trying to promote their own industries and their own self-sufficiencies is far better than opening up their economy to foreign exploitation or foreign promotion, or where they may lose a little bit of their own culture in the whole process. So that is how I would probably answer that question. The topic for today is all about fiscal policies, and fiscal policies is really the next unit. So we have now kind of moved on to Unit 5. We have completed macroeconomics last week with the trade blocks, and so we kind of ran out of ideas. So obviously when we come together again, we will have a test, and so we have no choice but to move on to the next unit, Unit 5. And one of the first topics is all about fiscal policies. I'm going to be putting this handout in Google Classroom probably today or tomorrow, and hopefully we will be able to benefit from this kind of translation, you might say, of a lot of what the book has to say. I mean, I need to sort of be very honest that, you know, chapter 5 is quite an important unit. It's not as big as Unit 4. Unit 4 of macroeconomics probably was the largest unit in the whole syllabus, but Unit 5 is also important, and fiscal policies is very much kind of intertwined or related to how Keynesians view the world. Okay, so fiscal policies are essentially taxing and spending. That's the easiest way to remember it, is taxing and spending. So if someone says fiscal policy, you stand up and say taxing and spending. That's what you're going to say. So if you look at your handout, it will say that fiscal policies is the use of taxation and government spending to manage aggregate demand in order to achieve the government's macroeconomic aims. Okay, governments have to make decisions about how much to spend, tax, and borrow. Both Keynesians and monetarist governments will use both fiscal and monetary policies, but clearly the Keynesians will put greater emphasis on the fiscal policies, and the monetarists will place greater importance on the monetary policies. And that's kind of important because a lot of students kind of lose the plot by saying that it's a bit like a football game. Okay, the Keynesians, they've got the fiscal policies, and the monetarists, they have their special, you know, toolkit, which is all about monetary policies. And it's not quite like that, because whether you're a conservative or liberal or Marxist, you're definitely going to have to deal with how do you spend money, and how do you tax the population, and who do you tax, and how much do you tax, etc., etc. So all of these things are important, but they are more important to a Keynesian. There's no doubt about it. They see fiscal policies as a bit like the catalyst to economic growth. That if you can get fiscal policies right, then somehow Keynesians' dream of having, you know, increasing aggregate demand and economic growth stimulated by consumption will be a reality. And monetarists don't see it that way. Monetarists are very scared of, you know, increasing aggregate demand, because they see that as being potentially inflationary. So these decisions will usually include distinctions between current and capital expenditure, direct and indirect taxation, as well as whether the taxes charged will be progressive, regressive, or proportional. Clearly, government budget decisions will also affect the level of aggregate demand and the pattern of economic activity in the economy. So what I'm saying here is that this is really what this section on fiscal policies is all about. Okay, you need to know, first of all, what is it all about, who uses it most often, and then what are the sort of the issues that are important for fiscal policies. And so obviously how you tax, you know, at what rate you're taxing. Is it proportional or regressive? Is it a flat tax? Do you tax everybody by 10%? Would that be a good idea? Would that be fair? Would that be equitable? Is equity important? A lot of people, you know, who believe in the Lorenz curve, okay, they're gonna, if you look at the Lorenz curve, you know, it's very obvious that a lot of people do not value equality. I mean, some people, particularly Marxist-Leninists, they are very touchy about the subject about equity, and they see it as a very strong priority for any socialist government is that they want to make people as equal as possible. And a lot of conservatives and a lot of monarchists, they don't care about equality. You know, they sort of feel, well, you know, if you're lazy, then you're going to not be wealthy, and if you're a hard worker, then you will be wealthy, which of course is not true. I mean, there's lots of hard-working people who don't make a lot of money, okay? And so teachers are a good example, I should say. We are good examples of people who are working our butts off, but don't make a lot of money, but because we love our job that we keep doing it. So for that reason, it's important to understand, you know, what are the issues. And I've tried to put in bold a lot of the important points. Things like budget deficits and the public debt and a balanced budget, and things like capital spending and transfer payments and current expenditure. These are all kind of important topics. I mean, I don't think it's necessary for me to go over them again. I mean, I want you to read this section. I want you to read it maybe 5 times. If I was you, I would read over it, because sometimes it's a difficult read, and so you need to read it a couple of times to make sure you understand it, and then you should be able to use this vocabulary and these skills to be able to give policies, you know, which will promote or discourage fiscal policies. On balance, are fiscal policies a good idea or a bad idea? Okay, that would be a good exam question, you know, and you would have to explain to me what it's all about. But, you know, you would have to be using all of these words, you know, like public debts and progressive taxations, and, you know, things like the Lorenz curve, etc., or the Laffer curve. You know, these are examples of terms of reference or vocabulary that you need to know. So taxes, as I said, can be divided into direct or indirect taxation, okay? And direct taxation tends to be things like income tax, when I pay about 25% or 30% of my income in taxes. And I have to admit right now, I feel that that's too much, but, you know, I accept it as my contribution to society. But it does seem like a lot of money, given that it doesn't feel like I'm getting a lot of benefits for that taxation. But obviously a lot of these benefits are quite sort of quiet and silent, things like security and the fact that the police are protecting me and that the army is protecting us from foreign invasion, that Donald Trump doesn't come and invade us, that we know that there will be people who will protect us. And these things cost money, whether it's street lights or anything else. We need to understand that public school teachers need to be paid, and they're usually paid through general taxation, and that's where most of the taxation that people like myself actually, where that money goes to. The sad reality is that in the modern world, income tax is becoming more and more of a difficult issue, because most people don't like paying income tax. I mean, I don't like paying it, but I pay it anyways, and they don't even give me a choice as to whether I want to pay it or not, because it's taken from my paycheck before I even receive my paycheck. So I don't even have the luxury of hiding my money from the taxman, because the taxman has already got to my money before even I've seen it. So for that reason, because it is difficult to get a lot of businesses to pay for their income tax, that a lot of the emphasis has now moved to indirect taxation or sales tax, because it's a lot easier for the government to raise revenue through putting, let's say, 10% on the bottom of your restaurant bill, for example, or if you go and buy a camera, then you will pay a level of tax. I just bought a computer keyboard the other day, and I had to pay a percentage tax on the keyboard. So this is a reality of life, and it is becoming more and more common that the direct taxation, which used to be like 40–50%, is coming down. to like 30%, 25%, 20%. Even in the United States, it's going even lower than that. Donald Trump is trying to reduce personal income tax as much as possible to win votes. Of course, it causes problems for paying off the debt, etc., and paying for public services. But other than that, there is a move towards increasing sales tax, which basically means that, the sales tax that may have been 5% last year now is 15 or 20%. In fact, in Canada, where I come from, I have to pay 22% sales tax. So if I buy a camera or if I buy a meal, I look at, buying a Big Mac at McDonald's, and I say, oh, that's going to cost me, let's say $3. So I get my $3 out and I put it on the table, and when the lady comes and charges me the money, it ends up being something like $4.50 because of the sales tax. And so they have decided to increase the emphasis or the importance on sales tax, shifting that tax burden away from direct taxation over to indirect taxation. And by doing so, the level of government revenue has gone up, and a lot of people feel better motivated to work hard because they feel that their income tax levels are going down, and therefore they say, oh, okay, well, now I'm actually keeping a lot more of the money that I was earning than I did before. But the reality of life is that you could manipulate the taxation for income tax to promote a certain amount of equity by making sure that as your salary went up, that the percentage increase of taxation also would go up. And by doing so, history has shown us that this will promote equity almost more than anything else. In fact, according to the IOCD, which is IOECD, I think it is, which is like an economic study group at the United Nations, a think tank, they have said that universal education and a progressive taxation are the two most important promoters of an equitable society. And there's no doubt about it that, in Canada, we used to have a super duper unequal society where you were either super rich or you were dirt poor. But today, I would say that the vast majority of the people are kind of middle class. About 90% are middle class, maybe 5% are super rich, and 5% are super poor. So that's a very different society, and that has been due partly because of progressive taxation. Well, you can't have progressive taxation if the emphasis on taxation is put on indirect taxation and sales tax. So you're going to pay, let's say, 10% for your hamburger, whether you're rich or you're poor. There's no way that you could somehow you could somehow charge a different person a different rate of sales tax, whether you were rich or poor. Like, how would you know? Like, how would McDonald's know? It's an unworkable model of example, you might say. So for that reason, we as an international community, we are moving away from income tax and we're moving towards sales tax. And, you might have to decide, is that a good idea or not? I mean, because of offshore banking, which is people hiding their money in these little banks on Caribbean islands, for example, it's very difficult to find people's money. So you got people like Richard Branson, who owns, Virgin Airlines, and he even has he's organizing a private spaceship, and he wants to be the first private company to go to the moon. And he even says he wants to go to Mars one day. If you pay enough, if you pay about $20 million, he'll put you on a spaceship and send you to the moon one day. But he doesn't seem to have enough money to pay his taxes. And so for that reason, he is creating a situation where You know, he puts a lot of his profits into these little banks in the Caribbean, and he kind of pretends to be poor, and because of that reason, governments are not able to get the taxation that they need to pay for public expenditure. Jeff Bezos is in the same situation. Bill Gates is the same situation. They pay almost no income tax. It's disgusting. It's evil. It's evil that super rich people never seem to pay their share of taxation. So we get into the next page, that was the fourth page. We're dealing a bit about the difference between expansionary and contractionary, depending on what you're trying to do. If you are a Keynesian, you want to expand the circular flow. You want to increase aggregate demand. You want to get people spending. So obviously, Keynesians will promote a policy of expansionary fiscal policies. In other words, they will do things to get more money into the hands of consumers, like tax cuts, for example, are a good example, or maybe the lowering the interest rates to make it cheaper to borrow. All these things will help to, to make it so that, taxing and spending will be easier for the average person to consume. If, on the other hand, you're a monetarist and you're saying, "Ooh, I'm not too sure about this. I think that too much money in the hands of too many people will actually cause inflation," then probably you're going to be playing around with the taxation and spending to make taxation probably even bigger for the average person, and spending is probably going to be even less. And so it will mean that, they're trying to take government out of the economy. So is this a good thing or a bad thing? You need to make that decision, really, So read over that section on expansion and contractionary issues. The last point that I really want to bring up is all about the multiplier effect. And it's one of those issues, it's a funny issue, because it's one of those issues that a lot of students have difficulty with. I'll try to find the bit that is the most important, which is obviously the definition. That the multiplier effect suggests that the impact on the economy caused by an injection of new money into the circular flow will be greater than the total sum of that injection. Okay? Now, in other words, if you bring in new money into the economy and you use that money, you will find that the impact on the economy as a whole will be much greater than the sum of money that you brought into the economy in the first place. And I try to make it somehow realistic or understandable for you by bringing in a concrete example. I said, if your grandmother in Canada sent you $100 for your birthday, you would go to spend that money by buying, let's say, a mobile telephone. The telephone company would use that money to pay their workers, and the workers would use that same money to pay their rent. So within hours, money can be used multiple times. It is believed in Canada that new money will be used on average 7 times before the money is withdrawn from the circular flow, perhaps by someone putting the money into the bank or by someone buying an imported product. Okay? So that's what the multiplier is. So in other words, if you bring in new money, you better be really careful, because the impact of any new money will be dramatically more than the sum of money that you brought in. So if you bring in $1 billion into the country, then if you are Canada, and this statistic is correct, and I don't know if it's correct, but that's what their theory is, that it will have the impact of, let's say, $7 billion on the Canadian economy. And that might be too much money. That might overwhelm the Canadian economy and have an overheated economy and cause inflation. So clearly this is an important issue regarding fiscal policies, and I would say that 2 out of 3 times the Cambridge exam has a question about the multiplier. So I want you to think about it. I've tried to translate it a little bit because just reading the book, I didn't feel that the book explained it very well. Okay, it's just my personal opinion. By reading the section on the multiplier, which is an important point of fiscal policies, I didn't feel that students would necessarily understand it very easily. So for that reason, I've tried to kind of, put it into terms of your grandmother sending you $100 from Canada type of thing. And obviously, if you have a situation, let's say we're Vietnam, where people will spend that money really, really quickly, then obviously the multiplier would probably be higher than would otherwise be the case. So as I said to you, that let's say in Canada, people receive money and maybe in 1 week's time they spend it, and then somebody else receives that money and they're going to spend it. So it's going to take them a bit of time before that money has actually gone through the system and eventually disappears through a withdrawal, maybe through the banking sector, or it is being paid in terms of buying imported goods. But if you have a situation where, low-income people who will probably spend that money quick, like if you give a poor person, anywhere in the world money, they will spend that money on food like today. And therefore, obviously, the multiplier would be a lot bigger. Now, why do we care about this? Well, we care about it because you don't want to screw up your economy. And if you were the Minister of Finance and you were kind of telling your government what they should do, and let's say the Prime Minister says to you, you know what, we've actually got an unemployment problem. There's too many people who are out of work, etc., etc. You go back to your statisticians and to your Ministry of Finance and you tell me how much extra money do we need to bring a little bit of equilibrium to the economy so that we will be able to lower unemployment to a level that is more acceptable. And so you kind of go away and you say, okay, well, in my opinion, if we could have $1 billion more circulating in the Vietnamese economy, that this would dramatically lower unemployment and that there would be lots of jobs for everybody, etc., etc. So you go back and you sort of, recommend to the government to have, let's say, a tax cut where the result will be $1 billion of new money suddenly starts floating around the economy because of a tax cut. Or you would find that probably the impact of that $1 billion might be $7 billion. So you may have correctly assumed that $1 billion was an okay amount of money to increase aggregate demand and get people into jobs, etc., etc. But $7 billion is way too much. And for that reason, you need to be cautious when you are either cutting money from the economy, which you might decide to do. Okay, the government might decide that they want to withdraw $1 billion out of the economy, maybe by increasing taxes or increasing different aspects of the economy, maybe the interest rates or the reserve ratio or the discount rate or anything like that. You may find that the government feels that, to avoid inflation, they want to withdraw $1 billion. And so, you somehow set up a strategy to withdraw $1 billion from your economy, and suddenly the real effect of withdrawing $1 billion from the economy is actually $7 billion. And that would suddenly make money in very short supply. You would cause huge unemployment, and the people probably would not want you to be in government anymore. They will argue that you have screwed up the economy, and that rather than making things better by withdrawing money out of the economy to stop inflation, you have actually taken too much money out of the economy because you failed to calculate the impact of the multiplier on any economic policy change. So that's what I want you to think about. I want you to read the handout. That's the best way to do it. It explains everything in this handout. And you've got 2 questions, okay? You've got 2 questions at the end, which I want you to answer for next Thursday at 12 o'clock. So the first one is, what is the multiplier effect and why should governments ignore it at their peril? Okay, that's kind of a flowery way to say, why should governments be really, really careful? Otherwise, governments are going to be blamed for, a crisis in the economy. So, in other words, why should governments, not ignore the multiplier effect? That's what they're really saying. And then secondly, why do Keynesians put such emphasis on fiscal policies to achieve their macroeconomic objectives? I think that's an easy question. You should probably start the answer by telling me what do Keynesians believe in, and why is it that fiscal policies are such an important and integral part of their policies. So those are the 2 questions. First one on multiplier effect, and second on fiscal policies. And that's about it for this week. So everything has changed, it seems. Everything seems to be getting more serious with this virus. They're closing down the university, as I say, so it's making life a bit more difficult for me. But I'm going to keep going, and I want you to keep going as well. And I know it's tough, and I know that you don't like it, and you'd probably prefer to be playing football or doing something else. But we have to keep going, and I'm expected to record everybody and who's done their homework and who hasn't done their homework, so that I have to send that information to the administration of Chuvanan, and they will send you a nasty letter, or send your mother or father a nasty letter to say that you're not doing your work properly. So you want a big kiss from your mother. Everybody wants a big kiss from their mother, even myself. I want a big kiss from my mother. So you're not going to get a big kiss from your mother unless you do your economics work. So bye-bye for now, and stay safe. I worry about all of you. I love you all, and I hope that we will be back next week. Bye-bye.